So, welcome to this edition of the Mindful Coach podcast, and I'm really excited that we have as a guest, special guest this week, Ilona Phillips. She is the founder of the Lotus Consulting organization. You would call it organization, or what do you call Lotus Consulting?
Yeah, or agency group practice, yeah.
And how many people do you have working there?
30 currently.
30. So she's grown her practice from a private practice to consultancy that has 30 people in it, which is quite an accomplishment. So that alone is a street cred enough to kind of want to talk to her. But she's also a specialist in working in a variety of different ways with eating disorders as well as lots of different kinds of difficulties and problems. She has a specialty with abuse, is that right? Like substance abuse or alcoholism as well? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And she brings a very mindful perspective to that, having a history of practice with mindfulness. So she's an excellent candidate here, or I should say, an excellent guest to have on the show. So welcome to the show, Ilona. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be here. Always great to connect with fellow coaches, therapists, and mindfulness practitioners. I'm delighted to be here.
So let me ask you, just to go back to kind of the beginning, or the first part of this is always like, well, how did you wind up here? Like, at what point did you turn around and go, you know what, my job in the world is to help other people? Like, what was it that lit that up for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually had a nice dialogue with Erin Hewitt that you had on your podcast not too long ago. And we sort of giggled and laughed because I feel like in the psychotherapy world, we often joke with our colleagues about whose trauma are you healing? Are you healing your trauma? Are you healing someone else's trauma?
Exactly, right.
Yeah, we all bring our stuff to this work for sure. I do come from Eastern Europe. I grew up behind the Iron Curtain, and that carries all kinds of baggage.
Oh my God. I mean, the weight of that just kind of hits me really hard. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
From behind the Iron Curtain. Mm-hmm. And so you experienced the whole transition from one basically gigantic, sudden cultural shift.
For sure,
wow.
For sure, and it does give me chills just thinking about that. I always felt sort of a little bit suffocated. We were not able to travel. Certainly media was managed for us, so on and so forth. Right. My father, though, always listened to Radio Free Europe, which my mother was so afraid of. Because we could be punished for that, obviously. But
because it was a crime. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it was suffocating in so many ways. But what always was an anchor for me was nature and just being outside. I grew up fairly free range, if you will. Different era, different time, different place. I'm probably a little bit more controlling with my children these days, but it's. I appreciate you sort of mentioning what a transition, and the truth is that when I flew to the U.S. in 1997, it was for the first time I was actually on an airplane, and it was a big flight.
In 97.
So mm-hmm.
Wow. I mean, in my long life, that's not that terribly long ago, really. Wow.
Some quarter of a century or so, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy, isn't it? I think about it. Oh, well, that's recent history for me. I'm like, wait, what? Yeah. Okay.
You're right. Yeah.
So you flew here, and it was like your first time on a plane. Mm-hmm. And so what happened from there? You landed, and what happened?
Oh my goodness! So that would be also a long story. So I'll be sure to keep it concise. But I landed at I think it was back home at about 2-3 a.m. It was very scary. Everyone advised me when you land in New York City, definitely take yellow cab. I didn't listen. It was a whole saga. But at that point, New York City was too big for me. Too overstimulating. Certainly exciting, but overstimulating. I come from a relatively small town, and so now when I return, I took my kids to New York City last year, and we loved it, and I love it. It's just I live a different life now. But it's certainly, when we talk about mindfulness.
Sure.
Boy, those, it was on steroids for sure. It was overwhelming. And so ultimately, though, my final destination was Columbus, Ohio, and I was a nanny for a year. And I just came to sort of improve my English language and return back. But things just happened differently.
Could you speak English at the time?
So I learned English in school. So first of all, we were mandated to learn Russian, but then in high school you were allowed to pick up another language. So I picked up English, and I really thought I spoke pretty darn well. I took an oral exam at the end of high school and aced it. But then you come to and it was British English, and then you come to the US and it's fast American slang. So it took a minute for me to adjust for sure. And then ultimately I decided to go back to school and. I thought I would be a lawyer one day, but then I had some fascinating psychology professors who absolutely changed the trajectory for me, whether it was organizational psych or psychopathology. I just loved it. And as we talked before we started today, right, a couple of them actually identify as Buddhists. And that was my first intro to really sort of more official mindfulness work and even Buddhism.
And so that's really connected with you clearly, and you pursued that somehow, and somehow this all transitioned. So you wanted to be a lawyer, and you connected with these influential instructors who were mindfulness folk in psychology. Were they in psychology?
Yeah, so they were psychology professors, and one of them actually ran Zen retreats in the middle of nowhere in the woods, and it was a whole thing. Yeah.
And this was in Ohio?
Yeah.
Wow. And so how was it that became a practice for you, like you became a social worker?
Yeah. So, from there on I sort of realized, and again, I have plenty of family history of trauma and addictions and all of that. So I think that there was a natural draw to psychopathology in particular and sort of psychotherapy. But even, again, interacting with this professor, right, the Zen retreats were often sort of for underserved populations, and there was a lot of charity work involved with that. And so, I think that I always wanted to be a helper in one way or another. I think the law pool was probably more related to geopolitical stuff, right?
Sure.
So you're certainly influenced by your culture and your upbringing, and honestly, back then, mental health care was really non-existent in my country, so it was not on my radar, right? It's really my education in the U.S. that really put mental health care and psychotherapy on the radar.
Yeah, and it's barely on the radar here, but at least, like you say, there was a place to plug in, so it's really great that you intersected that.
Yeah, and part of my, even in undergrad, part of my sort of, I took this world religion class and selected Buddhism ultimately to study and do a project on, and so that's where I was really intensively introduced to meditation and other practices, and I love yoga. It all makes sense for me, connecting to the mind and body.
Nice. And so from there, you went on to get, I gather, a degree in certification in social work.
Yeah.
And now you also wound up with a specialization in eating disorders as well. So somehow that came into focus for you.
Yeah. So, my grandfather died of alcoholism, so he was a product of Second World War. So I think that there was a pull toward that. And again, non-existent mental health care was really troubling for me in many ways. But also my father was shot multiple times and nearly died. And shortly thereafter, my sister developed an eating disorder. So, I think that, again, right, it's the whose trauma are we healing and sort of what are we trying to do. But honestly, one of my first internships in grad school was at Ohio State at the counseling center, and my direct supervisor was an eating disorder specialist who did phenomenal work. And, it's really easy to be influenced by someone who is a true artist in the room, if you will. So here I am.
I totally hear you. Well, what stands out to me from your story so far is the power of having the power of positive influences in our lives. Like already you've mentioned how just encountering these psychology professors and this person's supervisor, and how powerful of an influence that was on you to actually change the direction of your life. I'm really that stands out to me, and I just want to say, like, to you and I guess to myself and everyone, it's like, we can we can choose to be that kind of a force in the world, and it really matters. It really truly matters.
Yeah, it's such a ripple effect, right? They changed my life, and I have had the privilege to really impact a lot of other lives. So, yeah, whew, gives me the chills.
And so you wound up then with a certification. You're a social worker, and so
Correct.
you started to work on your own. Did you go to work for an organization then?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I did my internship at Ohio State, and then they hired me for a fellowship. So for the first 2 years after grad school, which you have a limited license, so it's really hard to work on your own, really. So I was lucky that way. But in the middle of the fellowship, I was hired by U of M, right, University of Michigan, and came here to do both generalist work, but also lead their substance abuse work. So I was the coordinator of alcohol and other drugs, and I also, my dream was to have private practice, mostly for flexibility and more freedom. There's so much that I received from working for these big universities, being part of a team, having access to
Sure.
research. All of these things are phenomenal. And that's still being part of a big machine, right? And so in private practice, it allowed me more flexibility. And at some point, push came to shove. And with kids, I had to decide which one am I going to keep. And so, I stayed in private practice, but I am fortunate enough to be right in the center of Ann Arbor. And so we're sort of like a college counseling center away from the college counseling center. The students walk to us. And so I've been really fortunate to keep working with students and faculty and sort of build my own center.
And so how did that happen that you decided to not just have a practice, but to be the leader of a group of practitioners?
Yeah, I will say that I sort of fell into it a little bit by accident. So back then, finding real estate field, finding offices was a little bit difficult downtown Ann Arbor. And when I was looking for an office, so I started by renting by the hour or paying someone by the hour, right, for space. And then finally I found my own space. And then I had to get out of that space and find a new one. And the only space that was available had 3 offices. It was a 3-office suite.
Oh,
And I
I
figured,
see.
okay, I'm going to have colleagues or I'm going to have employees. And ultimately, the folks that wanted to join me as part of my team. So that is really how it came about. And then, that's a long journey, but then also it accelerated so much during COVID, right? The demand for mental health services was so high and continues to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. I mean,
Another big.
those are such different challenges, but yeah.
Indeed. Yeah, well, in a certain way, this might seem a little sideways question, but I don't know why I'm going to ask it. Do you think that your experience coming from behind the Iron Curtain helped you transition during the COVID period?
Oh, such a big question, right? Because COVID really triggered and re-triggered all kinds of traumas for all of us.
I was wondering about that.
And particularly the constriction of COVID, right?
Yes.
And listen, there were folks dying and folks without resources, so I'm certainly no rock star here. But I would lie if I said that it didn't re-trigger, right, some of this stuff that, restriction is a big one for me. Especially, and certainly these are privilege problems, right? But the ability to not travel and certainly worry about family. My entire family is still there, right? So it has so many layers for sure. Different, and yet there's some overlaps for sure. And I think that I have always been a doer. My father has taught me to, no matter sort of what the restrictions are, you always somehow figure out a way, right? And so on one hand, I knew that we will figure out a way. We just gotta keep moving, and I think that that's what a lot of our clients experience, right? Like during COVID, most of us or many of us kept moving, just putting one foot in front of the other. And then, and COVID is not fully over, right? But when it really settled more, I think that that's when we started seeing folks really that trauma coming forward. It reminds me a little bit, and I certainly don't want to be reductive and minimizing combat trauma, for example, but you will have veterans who are able to manage their trauma while in combat, right? But then they come back, and that's when this stuff starts coming up. I mean, there are other layers to it, like not, reintegration into society, different kinds of issues, all of that. But that's what COVID reminds me a little bit of, sort of like the delayed reaction to the collective trauma that we all
have. Very interesting. I know for myself, I think one of the biggest impact on me somatically was just walking around in public space feeling like everyone is a potential threat.
The hypervigilance,
yeah, it's kind of like every single person is a potential threat, and whether they know it or not. And it's like I'd never had that before, really. I mean, I grew up in some pretty challenging circumstances, but from physical violence. But this was, non-physical. This is like just proximity to people could really have an impact on you. And it's like, and I'm looking around at the world and going, well, this is a really new experience for the entire population. I never heard anybody talk about it.
Yeah. For all of us, and especially, and also our helpers, right? I mean, for the first time, I felt like you're looking to me to sort of support you in something that I don't have figured out, right? So if I think about it, like, you don't want a counselor who is still actively in addiction or still actively in an eating disorder, right? Because they're not going to be super helpful. But here we were, right? Like experiencing the same darn trauma and challenges as our clients were. So that was tough. I mean, I think in some ways normalizing, I think that many of our clients sort of look to us like, oh, so it's not just me who is struggling with this, right? You also are struggling with.
Well, right. But I do think in those times, it's kind of like we might not be perfect facilitators in some ways, but we're as good as there are in some ways too, because it's kind of like you want someone who has some skills in navigating these choppy waters, even though the waters are still choppy, And so I hear what you're saying totally. It's a really important point. So I wanted to ask you about the coupling, the mindfulness impact, or the impact of your mindfulness connection to your work. How do you notice that shows up in a way that benefits you and your clients, or does it?
Absolutely. I certainly don't want to be dramatic, but I do not.
Go ahead.
I don't know what I would do without mindfulness, to be quite honest. Over the years, with variety of life challenges, it has literally kept me sane. I will go back to mindfulness any time of the day. If I am struggling, whether it's my mood or burnout, you name it, or, hopefully preventatively, so you don't get to those places, right? But I swear by mindfulness. And when it comes to the work, couple of different ways, right? I often start my sessions with a brief mindfulness exercise. We're not doing heavy meditation. It does not have sort of religious or spiritual undertones necessarily, right? But clients come in just like we do, with the barrage of events and thoughts from the outside world, right? But if we can start the session with a little bit of mindfulness, I call it we arrive. I know that sounds a little bit funky, right? Well, we sort of drop in and begin right here, right now, right? You let it a little bit settle. And then the work is just so different, I'm more in tune. They're more in tune with what's going on. Sometimes I'll throw it in sort of midway, right? Like if someone is really in their head and really giving me a lot of talk, which oftentimes folks have a lot to say, whether it's the intake or follow-up sessions, then we might drop in there and just slow it down. It's not to silence anyone, but to just slow it down, because we will get to the content as well, right?
Sure.
And it allows me, I was thinking about this the other day. I was a little bit grumbly in the kitchen and my husband is there and I said something and I could see just such a micro change in his face, right? clear as day, this disappointment, and it just allowed me to connect with them very differently. So whether it's my personal life or with my clients, beyond just, oh, I see you tapping your foot really fast, are you anxious, maybe you have ADD, but these micro movements or micro expression changes, right? Like, it just allows you to be so much more in tune with the client in the session. The other thing that it really sort of helps me, I think, that even with burnout, right, I close and open my sessions with what has been referred to as a sacred pause, just a couple of seconds right after the session. It's almost like a ritual, like it's like a closing. Even when the client is gone, right?
This is you with yourself?
This is for me. This is for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So right when the session ends, I will take my little moment to truly sort of complete it, if you will. And then I'm also better prepared for the next session, more present, right? Because otherwise we could just go. It can start blending in. And I sometimes see it, I supervise folks as well. And sometimes I see this in the newer folks in the field, that they try to fill in every, moment with tools and strategies and talking. And I know it. I mean, early on, I was sort of anxious too. I must provide folks with strategies and, all of that. But then we get just lost and we struggle more. It really, I know this is so redundant, but our clients heal when they feel heard, right? It is these moments for me and for the clients that make a difference in our work. So I could go on and on, so please stop me, chime in anything.
No, this is great. I mean, I love hearing this because it's so true, I believe, and powerful, and it's the kind of thing I teach as well in my work, but it's just, I love hearing it from everyone, and particularly from you, because you're living it, you're working it, and you're teaching it, and it makes it super powerful. And also the key I'm hearing in you sort of honoring what I call your organic nature, like giving yourself time to transition from one thing to another. And the way that changes the quality of your experience in your moment so that you can be more present for your clients. And like you said, it's kind of, they want to be heard. And I guess my question for people who might not be that familiar with, the impact of bringing mindfulness into your work, what do you think happens to the client whenever they notice that you're noticing?
Oh, they feel heard and validated. It's like, number one, right, there is space for me to really show up exactly as I am. I don't have to figure it out. I don't have to have it all together, meaning the client. She gets it. She gives me space. There's no judgment. We're just fully present,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the way I feel into that is like, it gives the client a lot of permission to just show up authentically, however they want, right? And like you say, if the coach is like trying to fill up all the space with, I've got to be the good coach. It's really important that I ask the powerful question right now. And how can I really strategically orient around this person's problem? It's not that can't be helpful, but there's not room for the client to kind of emerge more fully.
Yeah, and it can really get in the way. So listen, I am a pretty behavior-oriented therapist, right? I work dialectical behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. So there is still some agenda to my work. It's not always just like, let's just see what happens, right? Like, it's not that either. But there is this saying that if you listen with your ears, your eyes, and your heart open, you'll know exactly what to say and when. And so, yes, I will draw on the tools that I know, but the right ones based on what just happened. Right? As opposed to sort of like coming in with my agenda, today we should work on this. And it still would be grounded in what the client is coming in with and all that, but I am much more attuned to what's really needed in the moment. The answers just emerge. It just connects. So yes, it's still required of me to have tools to draw upon when it shows up, but I am able to do that more. I want to use the word precisely, but it doesn't sit well. Um, no, maybe more accurately. Let it come to surface, let sometimes I think of how we give kids what is it, like the snow globe jars, where right, they might be bombarded with thoughts and we just let it settle and then clarity comes. So,
Yeah, I use that analogy all the time. And I sometimes call it diamonds at your feet. And you can't see it because people are going, oh, where's how do I do this and how do I do that? And what's the answer to this? And like you mentioned earlier, it's kind of just helping people slow down a little bit. That in and of itself is therapeutic. That in and of itself is often very helpful to people. And when they do, not only, and when I do that as a coach, also I'll see, like you mentioned, I'll see ways to do things, what to say, opportunities to engage with the client during the session that you just don't see otherwise. It's kind of like, oh, here's that connection, and it's like was right there all the time. So it's like, oh yeah, there's a diamond just sitting right here, a jewel, if I can just notice it.
Yeah, it's just this opening, this clearing, in the forest. I heard that somewhere else. I can't remember where, but that's those are the words that come to my mind. Clearing in the forest, if you let it.
Yeah, beautiful.
And here's the thing. There's some clients, right, for whom just being with the present is not easy, right? Histories of trauma.
Exactly.
And so even when I do mindfulness, it's not, there are some clients who come to me and really actually want to practice more on the meditation side. But some folks, being with their breath or being with their thoughts is just way too much, whether it's ADHD, history of trauma. So we may start with just mindful eating or mindfully dropping into our senses, right? So what are the 5 things that you see? What are the 3 things you hear? So, implementing it also on a very individual basis.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's so true. And there's so many ways into the moment, right? So helping the client find what's accessible to them is really super valuable work, super valuable. A lot of that's the mindful coach method that is what I teach around that somatic. I'm trying to call it rehydrating the mind-body connection. And you have, and it's very specific for the client, right? So you have to find out what works for them. And coaching versus therapy, coaching, in this case, we're looking for what's what feels good, what's resources. Whereas in therapeutic, we're going to go into the woundedness, So, such great stuff. I'm so excited to be talking to you. So I wanted to ask you, for coaches out there that would like to bring more mindfulness into their work, what would you say would be a good way to begin to do that?
Are you thinking of someone who just doesn't have any mindfulness background, or?
Well, I'm thinking about, that's a great question. I would say someone who is maybe they've got MBSR training or some kind of training, but that's not necessarily interactive, It's like I can sit down and I can be present, but how do I make that work in my session?
Yeah, I would really love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think a lot of the things that I mentioned, right, could you be just starting with the mindful pause, with the let's just arrive today, or when you're noticing a client to be particularly fidgety, can you say that, right? I'm noticing that this seems really uncomfortable for you. How do you feel about us, maybe giving it that little pause here and see how it lands, what is here. And it's interesting. I had a couple of weeks ago, I had a session with a client who is generally, reports a lot of anxiety. It is quite difficult for him to be in his body. But we were still able to do that, particularly with attention to his senses, right? Like him at first paying attention
to his what?
to his senses, right? So
Oh,
what
yeah.
do you hear? What do you smell? What do you see? So my voice was grounding, right? Listening to the spaces between sounds. And then
Hmm.
eventually he was able to drop more into his body, and sort of doing a little bit of a touch and go on that.
So how was that for him when he did that?
Yeah, I mean, he said at first it was quite difficult, but he was able to access and sort of stay in his body for long. I mean, I'm certainly not torturing anyone if it's uncomfortable. People are,
Well,
free
no, no, of course not. But I
people
mean,
are
did he
free.
find that? Did he find that insightful or helpful?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. He was able to stay with so the anxiety was showing up mostly in his chest, right? And we were
Yes.
able to he was able to stay there long enough to feel it move.
Mm.
At first, it felt like it was growing, but then it actually shrank. So I will focus on qualities like that. Does it have a shape? Does it have a color,
Yeah, I
size?
love that.
Is it
Yeah, yeah.
moving? And sometimes folks think that we're supposed to sort of arrive all calm or arrive to a place of peace or not have any thoughts or that they're doing
No,
it
we're just
wrong.
exploring, right? Yeah, we're
Exactly.
just exploring.
Exploration is a great word for this, right? Is there a way for us to explore what's here? And even if it's, I really don't want to do this, there are too many thoughts. Okay, yeah. Can we ground into those feet
And let
or,
that be
yeah.
so. Just notice that it feels overwhelming, and we'll go as far or as little as you want to with this. So that'd be my kind of response, because
Yeah.
it's always giving the client authority
Yes.
to
To
do as
lead the
much or as
way.
little as they wish. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful. I love
And,
this so much.
yeah, and some of my folks and I do a lot of work with eating disorders, right? So we may do
Hmm.
just the mindful eating with a raisin. So many things come forward,
That's
as you do
true.
that. As you do that, right? As you are observing the raisin and smelling the raisin, and then you put it in your mouth. My clients sometimes will say, some of them will say, "Oh, I have had it in my fingers. We explored it, and now you want me to put it in my mouth, right?" And you see layers maybe of sort of OCD, right, coming forward, like, "That's
Yeah,
dirty. I
yeah,
can't
yeah.
do that." Or some of my clients will report, "Oh, I just wanted to eat the raisin really, really quick because I generally eat raisins by a handful or on a salad rather than just one. I was noticing the urge to swallow really fast," right? So it's these little tiny things that come forward that we were not even realizing.
No, it's so powerful to have the conscious intention to slow down and pay attention to your senses, because it's such a remarkably powerful skill in terms of up leveling the quality of our lives. And it's really hard to get people, if you just say let's do that, people go forget it. But when you do it, it's like, whoa, I can't believe what a difference it makes in my relationships and my therapeutic, in session work, and the quality of my moment drivings. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's so funny, right? Because it's kind of like we can talk about working out or we work out. Two very different things, right? So we can
It's
talk
so
about
true.
mindfulness or we can do mindfulness. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes time to feel the results, right? And they will come slow
Yeah,
and they will come in tiny places. But if you can stick with it, it's magic. And especially when I worked at the counseling center, I was college student with substance abuse, and you approach it also differently with some of these youngsters. I mean, some of these youngsters actually have access to mindfulness. They have done it. They're not new to it, right? But I remember one example that I would often give is this. When I was sort of starting with mindfulness, I remember coming from a grocery store and I'm bringing this bag of peaches and I pull one of them out and I just felt overjoyed by the array of colors on a darn peach.
isn't that
And they're
amazing?
looking at me like, were you tripping on something? Or, whoa, what was this?
That's some good stuff you're on there.
It's that kind of stuff, right? That mindfulness can really sort of enhance. I know this. If someone is new to mindfulness, this may sound a little crazy to folks, right? But it is that kind of enhancement, as you said, of our life experiences, our senses, our relationships.
Yeah,
It's just different presence.
it really is. And I I sometimes say the reason I got into coaching is and mindfulness work is because I wish I could lift and shift my moment-to-moment experience sometimes when I'm more in my true self, and because I think my experience of it is it's pretty rich at times, and a lot of times like this moment when you're lighting up around the peach, it's kind of like, oh my God, well, what if you could have 50 of those moments a day? And you can, right? And it's like, well, wouldn't that change your world? Wouldn't that change your relationship to the people around you? And doesn't that then also change their lives? And then therefore we have a better world all of a sudden. And so that's my wish.
I think that's really hard to grasp for folks, right? If you're not practicing. And also, right, like there's this, sometimes when I ask for sort of what are your goals for treatment, it may be something like, well, I wanna be happier. And you have to start unpacking what does that mean? And you're right. I mean, happiness oftentimes is this collection of these moments, milli moments, right? And small joys. It's not the winning the lottery. Like we know when you look at the research, right? Like folks who win lottery, and I think that even folks who are in life-changing injuries and stuff like that, I think that after 2 years or so they go back to their base level of happiness, if you will. And so this is what's sustainable. And I know I sort of feel like I'm trying to sell it.
Well, I don't feel that way.
But I'm just hoping that folks give it a try and find their own way.
Right, and it can be so simple, just noticing. I have a whole series of things that I teach called What Lights You Up. It's like one of the things I'll give my clients is like take an inventory of those moments where you notice what lights you up, and really just letting yourself have those on purpose. No, you don't go out and make them, but whenever you do experience something pleasant, you just go, oh, I'm having one of those moments. Just let yourself really have it, right? Like the peach or the sunset or the dog or the face or the sound or whatever it is that lights you up. And then neurologically, it's a somatic state shift. And it's really super important to notice those somatic state shifts in yourself if you're a coach or a therapist, because then you can be able to notice them in other people. You mentioned one earlier, like when you were talking about your husband, and he could just see the little micro expression, a little somatic shift happened there. Yeah. And you noticed it, and it changed the entire conversation.
That's right, it did. And it just deepens the relationship, right?
Yeah.
Because I can tend to that differently. As opposed to if I'm just moving through life so quickly and distracted. And listen, life is complicated, life is busy, so I certainly don't live in mindfulness all the darn time, right? But it's like you said, if those moments happen, it's such a gift. It really is.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, my wife feels like I'm a sham sometimes. She's like, well, you're a mindfulness coach. How are you acting this way?
Yeah, well, I heard it from somewhere as well. It's like, what happened to your practice? Yeah, well, I'm not enlightened, that's for sure. But I think what it also reminds me of, I remember when my children were really young, and that life is so stressful, right? Because you're like managing your jobs and you're trying to be on time and you got to take them to daycare and then there is an accident they have or something like that. You're rushing, right? And I would remember trying to get them in a car. At my house, in my garage, and all of a sudden one of them like steps out and there's like a dandelion right outside the garage. And they drop everything and just look, there's this dandelion, right? We're sort of born with it and then we lose it in the rushing. And certainly, we can live like the toddlers, but those are lovely reminders.
No, it's beautiful. Those are the diamonds at your feet, right? That's what we were talking about earlier, the jewels at your feet, and they're everywhere. Those moments are everywhere. This has been so much fun. How do people find you and your business, the Lotus Consulting, and connect with this great work that you're doing?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'm always happy to answer questions and connect with folks. So don't hesitate to reach out. For therapy, I'm only able to do therapy within the state of Michigan. The practice Lotus Consulting is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, so that website is just lotusconsultingplc.com. And I also, as I said, I do specialized work with eating disorders, and I have a separate website just specifically for parents and caregivers of kids with eating disorders, and that's just under ilonaphillips.com. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, well, I'll put all those links in the show notes so people can make it easy to access. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the way that you're bringing so much goodness and grace to those around you. I really appreciate it. Just personally, I appreciate it.
Yeah, right back at you. And I also appreciated the pause that we took right before we started. So I did see that you practice what you preach.
Well, thank you. I do have days where that works out pretty well. So thank you so much. And I appreciate you being here. I'll talk soon.
You're welcome.